The snow did not fall. It attacked. Driven by a wind with teeth, it came sideways, a horizontal blizzard that scoured the land and erased the line between earth and sky. It was a white violence, a cold fury that sought out every crack and crevice, every living thing left foolishly exposed. In the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the high plains, there was no shelter to be found, save for the dark, skeletal shapes of lone homesteads, islands in a churning sea of white. A shape moved through that sea. It was small, impossibly small, a bundle of rags and bone against the storm's terrible power. Each step was a plunge, a staggering lurch through drifts that rose past its knees. The wind tore at the thin wool of its coat, a garment meant for a mild autumn afternoon, not the black heart of a mountain winter. It offered no real protection. It was a gesture, a memory of warmth. The child did not cry out. The storm had stolen her voice hours ago, leaving only a raw, silent rasp in her throat. Her world had shrunk to the next step and the next. 1 foot, then the other. Lift, plunge. The burning in her lungs was a constant companion, as was the deeper, gnawing ache in her belly. But worse than the cold, worse than the hunger, was the weight. She clutched it to her chest with both hands, arms wrapped tight around it, her frozen fingers hooked into the worn leather. It was a book, a small plain ledger, its cover dark with moisture. It was heavy, not in the way a rock is heavy, but in the way a promise is heavy. Her mother had given it to her. Her mother had said, "Don't let them get it. Don't you ever let them get it. Run." So she ran. She ran until she could not feel her feet, until the world became a smear of white and gray. Now ahead, a light flickered. A single golden eye in the blizzard. A window. And beside it, a larger darkness. A barn. Hope was a dangerous thing, a cruel spark that could be extinguished as quickly as it came, but it was all she had left. She fixed her eyes on the light and stumbled forward. The barn door was a gaping maw, a slice of deeper black in the swirling chaos. One of the great doors was slightly ajar, shifted by the wind, a gap just wide enough. She fell through it, collapsing out of the wind's scream and into the sudden, shocking silence of the barn. The air inside was still and thick with the smell of hay and animal warmth. It was not warm, but it was not the wind. That was enough. She tried to crawl deeper, away from the opening, toward the shifting, breathing shapes in the stalls. Her strength was gone. The ledger slipped from her numb fingers and fell beside her in the dirt and straw. Her eyes, which had held the pinprick of light for so long, finally closed. The darkness that took her was absolute, and for the first time in a very long time, it was peaceful. A life was ending, and a life was about to begin again. The man who owned the barn did not know it. He sat at his rough-hewn table, a bottle and a glass his only company, the howl of the wind his only song. He was a man hollowed out by memory, a ghost haunting the rooms of his own life. The storm outside was a perfect mirror for the one that had been raging inside him for 5 long years. He welcomed it. He understood it. He poured another drink. The amber liquid, a familiar bitter fire. Then he heard it. A sound that did not belong. Not the wind, not the groaning of the old house. It was a shift in the rhythm of his world. One of the horses in the barn had stamped its feet, a sharp, nervous sound that spoke of a disturbance. He stilled, his hand hovering over his glass, listening. There it was again, a low, uneasy nicker. Something was wrong. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of a decade, he pushed himself away from the table. He grabbed the old oil lantern, its flame sputtering, and pulled on his heavy sheepskin coat. The cold hit him like a fist the moment he opened the door, stealing the air from his lungs. He bent his head against the wind and trudged the 30 yards from the house to the barn, the lantern light a fragile bubble against the oppressive dark. He slid through the same gap in the door the child had found. The horses shifted in their stalls, their large eyes wide and white in the lantern light. He ran a hand along his mare's neck, murmuring a low sound of comfort. "Easy now. Easy, girl. What's got you spooked?" His gaze swept the barn floor, following the beam of his lantern. He saw nothing but scattered hay, a discarded harness, the familiar shapes and shadows of his solitary life. He was about to turn back, to dismiss it as the storm getting into the animals' heads, when the light caught something. A small lump near the doors. A pile of rags, he thought at first. Maybe a sack that had blown in. Then the lump moved. It was a shudder, a tremor that ran through the small form. He froze, the lantern held high. He took a slow step closer, then another. It was not a sack. It was a child. A little girl, half buried in the loose straw, her face turned away from him. Her hair was matted with snow and dirt. One small hand was clenched into a fist. Beside her lay a dark, leather-bound book. 5 years old, maybe 6. No coat to speak of. In this storm, the hollow place inside him, the one he nursed with whiskey and silence, suddenly cracked. A terrible, forgotten feeling rushed in. Not pity, not yet. It was a stark, brutal shock, a confrontation with a reality so far removed from his own self-imposed misery that it defied comprehension. He knelt, the cold of the dirt floor seeping through his knees. He reached out a hesitant, calloused hand, a hand more familiar with the grip of an axe handle than a gentle touch, and brushed the hair from her face. Her skin was like ice. Her lips were a faint, terrifying shade of blue. But beneath his fingers, at the fragile pulse point of her neck, he felt it. A beat. Faint. Thready. But it was there. Now what you've just witnessed is the moment a storm inside a man meets a storm outside. It's the moment a life on the edge of ending finds an anchor. The story of this man and this little girl is just beginning. And it's a story about how the deepest wounds can sometimes be healed by the most unexpected burdens. If you believe in stories like this, if you believe that even in the darkest night a little light can change everything, then I'd ask you to do me a small favor. Hit that subscribe button. It lets me know you're out there, and it helps these stories find the people who need to hear them. And in the comments below, tell me what city or town you're listening from. It's a powerful thing to see a community of listeners stretching all across the world. Thank you for being here. Truly. Now let's get back to that barn and the choice that man was about to make. For a long moment, he just knelt there, the lantern light flickering across the child's still face. The world narrowed to this single impossible sight. A ghost had wandered into his refuge, a ghost of a life he had buried long ago. Part of him, the bitter, wounded part that had ruled him for 5 years, wanted to stand up, walk back to the house, and lock the door. It was not his problem. The world was full of sorrow, and he had drunk his fill of it. Adding another's cup to his own would drown him. But his body moved before his mind could agree. He shrugged off his heavy sheepskin coat, the sudden cold a sharp bite against his own skin, and wrapped it carefully around the small, still form. He scooped her up. She weighed nothing. A bird, a shadow. The feeling was terrifyingly familiar, a phantom weight in his arms that sent a tremor through his soul. He pushed the memory down, hard. Not now. There was no time for ghosts. He picked up the ledger, tucking it inside the coat with her, against the small warmth of her body. Then he turned and carried her out of the barn, back into the raging heart of the storm. The 30 yards to the house felt like a mile. The wind tore at him, trying to rip the precious bundle from his arms. He lowered his head, turning his back to the gale, and shielded her with his own body. He did not feel the cold. He felt only the fragile weight in his arms and the faint, fluttering heartbeat he was fighting to protect. Inside the house, the warmth from the stone fireplace was a physical presence. He didn't take her to the spare room, the one that had been empty for so long it was more a shrine than a bedroom. He couldn't. Instead, he carried her to the hearth, laying her gently on the worn bearskin rug that lay before the fire. He dropped the rifle. He dropped the lantern. His hands, usually so steady, were trembling. He worked with a grim, focused urgency. He peeled away her wet, frozen clothes, his touch as gentle as he could manage. Her skin was mottled, a patchwork of deathly white and angry red. Her feet were swollen and dark. Frostbite. Bad. He saw bruises on her arms, small and circular like fingerprints. He saw a long, ugly scratch on her cheek. This was not just the storm. The storm was the end of her story, not the beginning. He filled a basin with lukewarm water from the kettle, testing it carefully with his wrist. He soaked soft claws and began to dab at her skin, trying to bring life back to the frozen limbs. He did not try to warm her too quickly. He knew that much. He had seen it before, in a different war, a different life. Slow, gentle. As he worked, the house was silent save for the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind. And in that silence, his own ghosts began to speak. He saw another small face, pale with fever. He felt another small hand, hot and limp in his own. He heard his wife's voice, a desperate whisper of prayer in the dark. He had been helpless then. A man of action, a man who could track a wolf for 3 days or face down a killer without flinching, had been brought to his knees by a sickness he could not fight, a God he could not bargain with. He shook his head, forcing the images away. This was different. This was cold. This was hunger. These were things he could fight. He wrapped the child in his driest, softest wool blankets, tucking them around her until only her small, pale face was visible. He propped her head up with a pillow from his own bed. Then he went to the kitchen and ladled broth from the pot that was always simmering on the back of the stove. It was thin, mostly water and salt and the memory of a bone, but it was hot. He sat by her side on the rug, waiting. He watched the firelight play over her features, tracing the line of her jaw, the slight upturn of her nose. She looked so much like... No. He would not let his mind go there. He watched her chest for the small rise and fall of her breath. It was shallow, but it was steady. He had done what he could. Now it was up to her. He sat there for an hour, then 2, a silent vigil. The whiskey bottle sat on the table, forgotten. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, a fragile peace had settled. He did not know her name. He did not know where she had come from. He only knew that she was here, and he was here. And for the first time in 5 years, he was not alone. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. The first sign of her return was a flicker of her eyelids. He leaned forward, his breath held in his chest. Her eyes opened. They were a deep, startling blue, and they were filled with a terror so profound it struck him dumb. They darted around the room, taking in the strange ceiling, the dancing firelight, and finally, him. The child flinched, a violent full-body jerk, and tried to scramble away, to burrow deeper into the blankets, to disappear. A small animal sound of fear escaped her lips, a choked whimper. The man immediately drew back. He held up his hands, palms open, a gesture of peace he hadn't used in a lifetime. He made himself smaller, sinking back on his heels, trying to look as non-threatening as a man his size could. "Easy now," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. "Easy. You're safe here." The words meant nothing to her. They were just sounds made by a large, bearded stranger in a strange room. Her fear was a wild thing, and it was in complete control. Her eyes were locked on his, wide and unblinking. She was a cornered animal, ready to fight or flee, though she had the strength for neither. He knew better than to move closer. He stayed where he was, a few feet away, his hands visible and still. He averted his gaze, looking at the fire instead of at her, trying to release the pressure of his stare. "The storm," he said softly, speaking to the flames. "It's a bad one. You came in out of the storm. You're in my house. You're warm now." He didn't know if she was listening or if she could even understand. He just kept talking, his voice a low, steady murmur. He talked about the fire, about the old wood in the walls, about the mare in the barn who was afraid of thunder. He spoke of simple things, solid things, trying to build a bridge of sound across the chasm of her fear. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rigid terror in her small body began to ease. The wildness in her eyes receded, replaced by a watchful, wary intelligence. She was still afraid, but she was listening. He risked a glance at her. She was watching him, her small face a mask of suspicion. He remembered the broth. Without a word, he stood up slowly, never turning his back on her completely. He moved to the stove and retrieved the mug. He sat back down in his original spot, placing the steaming mug on the floor between them, well within her reach, but not so close as to be a demand. "You must be hungry," he said, again to the fire. "It's just broth. Not much, but it's hot." He waited. He did not look at her. He gave her the time and space to make her own choice. The silence stretched, filled only by the sounds of the house in the storm. He could feel her gaze on the mug, then on him, then back to the mug. He heard a small, sharp intake of breath. A tiny, chapped hand emerged from the cocoon of blankets. It trembled violently as it reached for the mug. Her fingers were too weak to hold it properly. She managed to drag it closer, sloshing some of the hot liquid onto the rug. She bent her head and began to lap at the broth like a kitten, her whole body shaking with the effort. The sight broke something inside him. The carefully constructed wall he had built around his heart crumbled into dust. This small, desperate act of survival was more powerful than any storm, more profound than any grief. She finished the broth, her breathing ragged. She set the mug down and looked at him. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a deep, bottomless exhaustion. 2 large tears welled up and rolled down her dirt-streaked cheeks, silent and heartbreaking. She didn't make a sound. She just cried, the first release of a pain and terror he could not begin to imagine. Then her eyelids fluttered and closed. Her small body went limp, and she fell back into a deep, healing sleep. He did not move for a long time. He just sat and watched her, the empty mug between them a testament to the first fragile thread of trust. The storm could rage all it wanted. A different kind of storm had just passed through his house, and it had left behind a terrible, wondrous calm. He stayed by the fire all night, a silent guardian. He added logs to the flames, keeping the room warm and bright against the pressing darkness. He watched the steady, even rhythm of her breathing, a sight more precious to him than a sunrise. In the quiet hours before dawn, as the storm outside began to weary, he allowed himself to think. Who was she? Where had her journey begun, and where was it supposed to end? The bruises on her arms were not from a fall. The fear in her eyes was not just of the cold. Someone had hurt this child. Someone had sent her running into a blizzard, and she had been carrying that book, that ledger, as if it were her own heart. When the first weak gray light of morning filtered through the window, he gently reached into the folds of his coat, which still lay near the hearth, and retrieved the book. It was a simple accountant's ledger, the kind a small rancher or a town merchant might use. The leather was worn smooth in places, and the front was bare, with no name or marking. He opened it carefully. The pages were filled with a neat, precise hand. It was not a record of grain sales or cattle prices. It was a list of names, dates, and amounts. Beside each entry were short, cryptic notes: land deed transfer, duress; water rights, forged signature; Silas Blackwood, claim intimidation. His breath caught in his throat. Silas Blackwood. The name was a ghost from his past, a specter he had fled to this remote corner of the world to escape. Blackwood was a man who bought souls and buried secrets, a wealthy magnate who had built an empire on the ruins of other men's lives. He owned the biggest ranch in the county, the bank in town, and half the sheriff's department. He was a cancer on the land, and the man reading the ledger knew his methods all too well, because he had once been the man sent to enforce them. He flipped through the pages, his heart pounding a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. It was all here, a meticulous record of Blackwood's crimes, a decade's worth of extortion, theft, and violence, all laid out in perfect, damning detail. This book was not just a ledger. It was a weapon. It was a death sentence for the man who wrote it, and for anyone caught holding it. He looked over at the sleeping child, her mother. It must have been her mother who kept this record, and her mother must be gone. Blackwood did not leave loose ends. A cold, hard fury began to build in his chest, a feeling he had not allowed himself to feel in years. It was a clean, righteous anger that burned away the fog of grief and whiskey. He had run from Blackwood's world once before, after it had cost him everything. He had told himself he was done, that he had no more fight left in him. He had been wrong. The child stirred, her brow furrowed in a troubled dream. She whimpered, a soft, frightened sound. He reached out and gently placed his large, rough hand on her shoulder. "Shh," he whispered. "You're safe. I'm here." She settled at his touch, sinking back into a peaceful sleep. He left his hand there, a silent promise. He looked from her innocent face to the damning evidence in the ledger. The choice was no longer his to make. It had been made for him the moment she stumbled into his barn. He could not run from this. He could not hide. His past had found him, in the form of a small broken child, and he would not fail her. She slept for most of the day. He let her be, knowing her body needed the rest more than anything. He moved about the cabin with a newfound purpose, his steps quiet but firm. He cooked a real meal, a thick stew with potatoes and the last of his salted meat. The aroma filled the small space, a smell of life and sustenance. He found a small crate, and with his knife, carefully carved a few crude animal figures, a horse, a bird, a wolf. He set them on the hearth, where she would see them when she woke. He did not know why he did it. It was an instinct, a forgotten impulse to create something gentle in a harsh world. She woke in the late afternoon as the light outside began to fade to a deep, bruised purple. This time there was no panic. She opened her eyes and simply watched him as he stirred the stew. Her gaze was steady, her old soul seriousness back in place. "Hello," he said softly, not turning around. "I made some stew. I reckon you're hungry again." He heard a small rustle of blankets. He turned, a bowl in his hands. She was sitting up, the wool blankets pooled around her waist. She looked at the bowl, then at his face. "You got a name, little one?" he asked gently. She hesitated, her eyes dropping to her hands. She picked at a loose thread on the blanket. "Lily," she whispered. Her voice was like the sound of dry leaves skittering across a stone. "Lily," he repeated. The name was beautiful. It felt strange and wonderful on his tongue. "That's a fine name. My name is Silas." He gave her the bowl of stew. She took it, her hands steadier now, and began to eat. She ate slowly this time, carefully, as if savoring each bite. He sat across from her, eating his own meal in a comfortable silence. When she was finished, she set the empty bowl aside. She looked at the small wooden animals he had carved. She reached out a finger and gently touched the horse. "My papa made me one of these," she said, her voice barely audible, "before he went away." Silas's heart clenched. "He was a good carver, was he?" She nodded. "He was a good man. The man in the black coat said he was a thief. But he wasn't. My mama said he was honest. That's why Mr. Blackwood hated him." The pieces clicked into place. The ledger. It was her father's. He had been Blackwood's bookkeeper, the honest man who had decided he could no longer stay silent. The man Blackwood had disposed of. "What happened to your mama, Lily?" Silas asked, his voice low and tight. Lily's gaze drifted to the fire. "The man with the scar came to the house. The one who works for Mr. Blackwood. Mama gave me the book. She put me out the back window. She told me to run to the old mission road and follow it north. She said to find a man who lived alone near the Twin Rocks. She said he was a good man once, that he would help." She looked at him then, her blue eyes piercing him to the core. She said his name was Silas. The world tilted on its axis. The air left his lungs in a rush. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a random act of fate that had brought her to his door. She had been sent to him. Her mother, a woman he likely never knew, had known of him. She had known his story, his shame, his hiding place. And in her final, desperate act, she had placed her daughter's life and the proof of her husband's murder in his hands. She had bet everything on the hope that the man he used to be was still in there somewhere. A wave of profound, crushing guilt washed over him. He had run. He had hidden himself away in his grief, believing he owed the world nothing. But his past was not done with him. A debt was being called in. "The man with the scar," Silas said, his voice a rasp. "Did he see you?" Lily shook her head. "I don't think so. I hid in the woodpile. I waited until it was dark. Then I ran. I ran for a long time." She had run for 2 days, through a frozen wilderness, with a storm on her heels and killers behind her. A child of 6. He looked at her impossible strength, her quiet resilience, and he felt a surge of awe. She was more of a fighter than he had been In 5 years, his own loss had shattered him. Her loss had forged her into steel. He thought of the life he had built here, this quiet fortress of solitude. It was a lie. It wasn't a fortress, it was a prison, and the door had just been blown off its hinges. Blackwood's men would not stop looking for that ledger. When they realized the girl was gone, they would start searching. They would sweep the countryside, and there were not many isolated homesteads north of the Mission Road. It was only a matter of time before they found their way here. His jaw locked. His hands, resting on his knees, curled into tight fists. The anger from the morning returned, but it was different now. It was colder, sharper. It was not the hot rage of vengeance. It was the icy resolve of a protector. The part of him that had been a lawman, the part of him that had once stood between the innocent and the wicked, was stirring from its long slumber. He had failed his own family. He had been unable to protect them from the randomness of fate, from the cruelty of disease. But this was different. This was not fate. This was a man with a name and a face, a man he knew, and a man could be stopped. Lily's small voice cut through his thoughts, pulling him back from the dark place he had gone. "Sir?" He looked at her. Her face was clouded with a worry that no child should ever have to carry. "Are they going to kill me, too?" The question was simple, factual, uttered with the calm acceptance of a child who had already seen too much of the world's ugliness. It was not a plea for comfort. It was a request for information. And it landed on Silas like a physical blow, knocking the last of the bitterness and self-pity out of him forever. He moved from his spot and knelt before her on the rug. He looked directly into her eyes, letting her see the truth of what he was about to say. "No," he said, his voice absolute, without a trace of doubt. "They are not." He reached out and took her small hand in his. Her fingers were so tiny, they disappeared inside his grip. "I promise you, Lily," he said, the words feeling like a sacred vow, an oath sworn on the graves of his wife and daughter. "I will not let anyone hurt you. Nobody is going to hurt you here. Not while I'm alive." For the first time, a flicker of something other than fear or exhaustion appeared in her eyes. It was a fragile, tentative shoot of trust. She squeezed his hand, a barely perceptible pressure. "You promise," she whispered. "I promise," he said, "on my life." He stood up. The decision was made. The long winter of his soul was over. He walked over to the corner of the room where a tall, dusty cabinet stood. He opened it. Inside, leaning against the back wall, was his old service rifle, untouched for 5 years. He took it out. The weight of it was familiar, comfortable. He ran a hand along the smooth, oiled stock. It felt like shaking hands with an old friend. He went to the small pantry and found the box of cartridges. He brought them back to the table, and with methodical, practiced movements, began to clean the rifle. The scent of gun oil filled the air, a smell of purpose and grim readiness. He was no longer a hermit hiding from his ghosts. He was a guardian. He was a soldier. Lily watched him, her expression unreadable. She did not seem frightened by the weapon. In her world, it was the men, not their tools, that were to be feared. She seemed to understand, in that intuitive way of children, that this rifle was for her. It was the physical manifestation of his promise. When he was finished, he propped the gleaming rifle by the front door where it was ready. Then he did something he hadn't done in half a decade. He walked to the table, picked up the half-empty bottle of whiskey, and without a moment's hesitation, poured the entire contents into the fire. The flames roared up with a blue-white flash, a final fiery exorcism of the man he had been. He turned back to the girl on the hearth. She was struggling to keep her eyes open, the warmth of the fire and the food in her belly pulling her back toward sleep. "Go to sleep now, Lily," he said, his voice softer than he ever remembered it being. "You need to rest. You need to get your strength back." Her eyelids fluttered. Will you still be here when I open my eyes?" The question was a child's simple fear of abandonment, but for him it was everything. It was the anchor he didn't know he needed. "I'll be right here," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She gave him a small, sleepy nod and curled up in the blankets, her face turned toward the fire. Within moments, she was asleep. Silas stood for a long time watching her. The child, the ledger, the promise. His life, which had been a straight, barren road leading to a lonely grave, had suddenly forked. The new path was dark and dangerous, leading straight back into the world of violence and pain he had tried so desperately to escape. It would lead him back to Silas Blackwood. It would likely lead him to his death. But it was a path with meaning. He pulled on his coat and stepped outside. The storm had broken. The wind had died and the clouds had parted to reveal a sky of impossible clarity, filled with a billion sharp, cold stars. The world was blanketed in a pristine, silent layer of fresh snow. It was a beautiful, peaceful scene. But he knew it was a lie. He knew that somewhere out there, under that same star-filled sky, men were getting on their horses, men with scars and black coats. They would be coming. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they would come. He looked out at the vast, white emptiness, at the dark line of the mountains on the horizon. He was one man, in an isolated cabin, against a small army. The odds were impossible. He should have been afraid. He wasn't. He felt a calm he hadn't known since before the fever came, before the small graves were dug. He felt a sense of purpose that was as solid and real as the frozen ground beneath his feet. Let them come. He was no longer a ghost. He was a wall, and he would not be moved. He turned and went back inside, quietly closing the door on the cold, silent world, ready for the war that was coming to his doorstep.